And our devotional thought today, the topic is others' opinions of us. To start off this morning, we're going to look at a story from when Jesus was on earth. So if you have a Bible available, or you can search for the Bible online, we're going to be reading a story found in Matthew chapter 11. I will be reading partly from the NIV and partly from the complete Jewish Bible version. So, first of all, to make sure that we understand the context of this story, in the previous chapter, chapter 10, Jesus has just sent out his disciples to go spread the news about him and what he's doing in the whole country. In Matthew 10, Jesus has given instructions to his disciples as to what to say and how to act as they travel through villages and towns. So that's the context leading up to the chapter we're going to look at today, chapter 11. So let's jump right into it and read Matthew chapter 11, verse 1 to 3, where it says, "After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, who was in prison, heard about the things the Messiah was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, 'Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?'" So, while Jesus is teaching and preaching in the towns of Galilee, his cousin John is in prison at the time. Now, if you remember John, also called John the Baptist, he had begun announcing the arrival of God's kingdom and that God's kingdom was coming before Jesus officially began his public ministry. John told everyone who would listen that Jesus was the God-chosen king the whole of Israel had been waiting for. But John has had a hard time since then and gotten into trouble with Herod, who was a puppet king in Judah, placed there by the ruling power of Rome. And Herod did not like what John had to say, so he threw him in prison. But it would seem that even from his prison dungeon, bits of news about what Jesus was doing reached his ears. So John sends for his disciples. They come and visit him, and he says, "Go to Jesus for me and ask, 'Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?'" In other words, are you the Messiah, the God-chosen king who is coming to rescue us from our oppression, or should we be looking elsewhere? Well, what does Jesus reply to this message? Let's have a look. Verse 4 to 6. Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is announced to the poor. How blessed is anyone who is not offended by me." So Jesus hears John's question, "Are you the one we're expecting?" And in reply, he says, "Go back and tell John what I am doing. Tell him what you hear and see. In other words, let my actions speak for themselves." Now, as Jesus has finished talking and sending this message to John's disciples, he turns back to the crowd that's around him and says the following, "Oh, what can I compare this generation to? They're like children sitting in the marketplace, calling out to others, 'We made happy music, but you wouldn't dance. We made sad music, but you wouldn't cry.' For John came fasting, not drinking, so they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating freely and drinking wine, so they say, 'Aha, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' Well, the proof of wisdom is in the actions it produces." So let's unpack this a little bit. Jesus is saying to his surrounding listeners, this generation, meaning all you guys listening to me, remind me of children sitting in the marketplace and they're shouting out the following little poem or rhyme to people as they pass, saying, "We made happy music, but you wouldn't dance. We made sad music, but you wouldn't cry." In the original Greek, which the text was written in, it actually suggests rather the translation, "We played flutes," or "we fluted for you, and you did not dance." And in Hebrew culture, flutes were often associated with weddings because flutes were instruments played often at happy celebrations, happy events where people danced, such as weddings. Some of you may be familiar with the English saying, if I say jump, you say how high. This expression simply means that I expect you to do what I tell you to do and follow orders without question, like an obedient dog. So if I say to you, jump, you're simply to reply, how high? Now, Jesus here is comparing people around him to bored children sitting in the marketplace, yelling out at strangers, "Do as we say. If we play happy music, you better dance a happy dance. And if we play sad music, you better cry." In other words, jump. So what is Jesus talking about here? What is he saying to the crowds? Well, he's talking about other people's expectations. Not just of him, but of John as well. Let's read again verse 18 to 19, where it says, "For John came fasting, not drinking, so they say he has a demon. The Son of Man," which is the name Jesus often called himself, "came eating freely and drinking wine, so they say, aha, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." So Jesus is saying, John came, he wore animal skin, he was poor, he lived in the desert, he ate locusts and wild honey, he had no property, and he did not live an extravagant life. John fasted and didn't drink, and in response you all said about him, he has a demon. He's possessed because of the way that he lives. And then Jesus says, now I come along and I do the opposite. I eat freely at your houses. I attend parties at the homes of tax collectors, prostitutes, and those considered scandalous. Well, if you thought that John was possessed, you now think, well, Jesus is greedy and a drunk, a friend of the worst people. Now, whether you're used to being in a religious context or not, you probably know a John in your life. You know someone who never parties, never drinks, lives with the bare minimum, wears the most conservative and simple clothes, keeps all the religious rules, and deprives themselves of indulging in their appetites. You probably also know someone who lives more the opposite way. They see life as a celebration, and they eat freely and drink and dance and party. They perhaps wear fashionable clothes or makeup, or keep company that some churchgoers would frown at. Jesus' point here is not to say that either him or John was doing anything wrong. His point is actually quite the opposite, that both Jesus and John were living their lives very, very right, because Jesus and John were right with God. In other words, they were both righteous. They were right in their relationship with God. Jesus is pointing out that no matter what a righteous person does in his generation, they will criticize them. Whether they are conservative and living in the desert or eating and celebrating, people will judge them, call them names, and accuse them all of sorts of things. Jesus was demonstrating that his generation misjudges people. People at both ends of the pole, at both extremes, the Jesuses of the world and the Johns of the world, both extremes of righteous living. And so it would seem that no matter what Jesus or John did, people would unjustly judge them or label them as something ugly. Now, expectations will always exist in our relationship with other people, and expectations in themselves are not wrong. In fact, having or expressing expectations is a sign of a healthy, functioning relationship. And a lack of expectations at all suggests also a lack of values, priorities, boundaries, and deliberate decision making. But if Jesus, the best human who ever walked the earth, he who himself is God, who is our only rightful judge and was without sin, couldn't avoid the judgment of others, what makes us think that we can? And like Jesus said, this is true of whether you are considered or seen as the most conservative or the most liberal. You are under no obligation to make sense to everyone. Not even Jesus could accomplish that. And others' expectations would be the death of us if we let them be. There can be healthy expectations in relationships, but obeying every expectation put to us is not living in love or freedom. Expectations ought to be examined and questioned. So Jesus invites his followers to live under a higher, better authority than obeying every expectation of other people. We are called to be more than merely people pleasers. We are called to not just dance when someone tells us to, be happy or be sad when someone expects us to be. And so in this story, what does Jesus conclude about the people shouting like children in the marketplace? Well, let's read it again. He says in verse 19, the proof of wisdom is in the actions it produces. In other words, actions are proof of whether something is wise or not, whether something is right or not. And what were the actions that stood as proof to back up Jesus' decisions? Well, if you remember, this story began with John sending messengers to Jesus asking, "Are you the one we are waiting for? Are you the one we are expecting?" And it would seem that even John had expectations of what it would be like when the Messiah King arrived, and his expectations did not include him sitting in prison. And Jesus replied to John, and his confused expectations were the following. Jesus replied, "John, look at what's happening. People are being healed, they're being helped, they're being loved, they're being given hope. This is the proof of the wisdom that I hold. This is the proof of my righteousness. This is the proof that God has sent me and I am the King." It's okay for you and I to live a life that doesn't make sense to everyone and not everyone understands or approves of. Accepting this is not simply being a mindless rebel, it is acknowledging that our generation, just like the generation at the time of Jesus, sometimes has unreasonable and blind demands of how they expect us to act, specifically how they expect righteousness and righteous living to look. And whether you are the most conservative John or seen as the most indulgent liberal like Jesus, it is not what others expect of you or their disappointments which define whether you're making the right choices or not. Finally, Paul wrote in his letter to the church in Galatia, Galatians 1:10, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." The thought I'd like us to take away today is that it's okay if you don't live up to everyone's expectations of you. Not even Jesus could fit the description of what they thought a righteous person should look like. And he is righteousness itself. But when we focus on our relationship with him and not on what other people think of us, then really good things tend to happen as a result.